Hello, and welcome to today's Augustana Human Library session. The title of today's human book is Poor Like Me, and this is the human book's abstract. Growing up in Winnipeg's North End, which was on the wrong side of the tracks, had its challenges and its rewards. Our family was labeled as DPs, Displaced Persons, and a somewhat derogatory term for innocent civilian victims of World War II. Language barriers and low employment most often led to poverty. Being poor did, however, whet one's appetite to rise above the situation. Nevertheless, you always retain the imprint on your soul of the upbringing that was nurtured on the wrong side of the tracks. Thank you for being here today, and welcome, Poor Like Me.
Thank you, Nancy, for the opportunity, and welcome everybody to my talk on Poor Like Me. And at the end of the talk, I shall give you each a gift, 2 gifts actually. So let me suggest that we're going to start in Germany and go to Ontario, go to Manitoba, and finally end up here in Alberta. My story begins in Germany because that's where I was born, and my parents were both forced laborers in Germany. They had, when they were young in the Ukraine, teenagers, poverty was a big issue there. And so therefore they wanted to go to Europe and sort of earn some money. But the war had started, and when they got to the train station, the German soldiers simply said that they were going to Germany to work in either industry or agriculture, etc. So they had no choice. And needless to say, with those jobs, there was no pay. It was a forced labor. And in the old days, they called it actually slave labor because that's what it was. And at its peak, I think Germany had about 20 million such forced laborers. People in concentration camps were, of course, included in that. So my mother worked on a dairy farm. My father worked in a brewery in a city. And after the war ended, they were then liberated, in the matter of speaking, from that servitude, in the matter of speaking, and were then placed in displaced persons camps, which were surrounded by the British and American forces, simply because the Russians were very interested in repatriating their citizens. Repatriation really meant was that you were a traitor that they wanted back and were then going to send you to the Gulag or something of that nature. So being from the western part of the Ukraine, they could convince the authorities that they were not Russian and could then be sort of freed from any kind of repatriation. But they then had to find a country that would take them. And initially they had, and I was born in 1947. So I was 2 years old at the time when they had to make the decision. And they wanted to go to Brazil, but Brazil did not want families with children. So my father secured a 1-year contract for passage to Canada, and he had to work in a gold mine in a place called Pickle Crow, Ontario. And my mother and I later came by ship. He came by ship, of course, and later came by ship to Halifax, and we made our way to Pickle Crow. And after the year contract was over, my father had connections in Manitoba. His father was working on the section gangs for the CNR, or the Via Railway, in Saskatchewan, and he had an uncle working for the railway in Winnipeg. So he had connections, and we were sent over to a place called Selkirk, Manitoba, which was a settlement area. And East Selkirk had a very high concentration of Ukrainian sort of settlers. So my father, I don't know how he got the money. He must have borrowed it from his grandfather and uncle, my grandfather and uncle. And he bought a small farm. You could call it an acreage, really, about 10 acres. And there was mixed farming. And so we started our lives there. And again, in poverty, there was no money to speak of. My father and mother both really had a basic primary education. I think she had 2.5 grades and he had 3. So basically manual labor was the only thing that was possible. And my father worked in the sort of so-called steel rolling mills in Selkirk. And in winter, if he was laid off, he would go and cut cordwood for firewood for sale, etc. So, you know, they knew how to make a living, but that was just about it. As a child, of course, you're oblivious to that because all you're interested in is being fed and sheltered and clothed, etc. So I had no sense of what poverty was like, but we lived very simply in a sense that we basically did not have to buy groceries because we were self-sufficient, other than, you know, needing sugar or salt and things of that sort. So we did quite well. My first language, of course, was Ukrainian, so I had to learn English in school. And I went to school in East Selkirk at a place called Happy Thought School for grades 1 and 2 and learned English. And then we had a tragedy. Our house burned down. And so therefore, I think it was about the spring that it burned down. So my father simply took a granary and converted it into living quarters for us. So he made beds and benches and tables and so forth. You know, and we had an outhouse, we had a well where we kept our milk and cream and so forth down the well. There was a pump there too for water. So basically, we didn't have electricity. We had coal oil lamps and so forth. So I have vague memories of living that experience because by then I was about 7 years old and recognized that, you know, but I did not recognize that we were poor. I mean, after the house burnt down, one of the churches gave us clothing, and I vividly remember getting a boy's Cubs outfit and not understanding what it was all about, but it was, you know, with badges on it and on. So my father then got employment with the CNR in Winnipeg through his uncle. And we stayed in a rental house that my father's uncle had. And basically it was a 2-story rental, but we just basically used the first floor. Again, not feeling we needed sort of space. By that time, the family was extended to my brother and to my sister. So there were 3 children and 2 adults. And my father wanted to have his own place. So he, within a year, again, saved, borrowed, had money from the insurance, and he bought a 4-plex in the north part of Winnipeg, the north end, the so-called north end. And it was a 4-plex of 1-bedroom apartments, small 1-bedroom apartments. So for a good number of years, I'd say about 5 years, I lived in a 1-bedroom apartment with my siblings and my parents. My sister had the couch in the living room, and my brother and I had the bed, the double bed in the living room, and my parents had the bedroom. So we never again knew that that was, you know, unreasonable, that we should all have our own bedrooms, etc. We just lived that way. Life was simple, and everything was basic. The north end at that time was a rather inexpensive part of Winnipeg because it was also the oldest part. The area we lived in was called the Point Douglas area, which was, I think, first settled in about 1812. So it was very old, on the banks of the Red River. And adjacent to where we were living on Lorne Avenue, there was a beautiful large park. So basically the playground was the park, the streets, etc. So the kids never had a sense that they were being deprived of playgrounds, in a matter of speaking. Because we had limited space, I never had kids over to our place, and similarly, we never went anywhere else because the other families were, as we were, poor. So when you're living in poverty and you don't know it, you don't really sort of object to it. You just sort of live it and enjoy life. So I was then going to a primary school. finishing off grades 4 through 6 in this area, and the school was just 1 block away. So I had a park, I had a school that I could walk to and walk home from, and everything was just fine. My mother was a very sensible woman. She was a good cook. We had very basic food. She made large portions at the beginning of the week, and then we ate the similar meals throughout. You never said, well, I shouldn't be eating the same thing day after day. It was just the reality of it. The food was always good and nutritious. We didn't have a variety of clothing. I'd say about 2 or 3 different sets. So when I was going to school, I was always well dressed in the sense of clean clothing, etc. But it wasn't stylish or whatever. And and everybody else was in the same boat. So that another thing is we really did not have televisions at that time. There were a few kids who had televisions, and so therefore you either played outside, came home late at night, and went to bed, and that was about it. The tragedy for us was that the few kids who did have televisions would actually stop during a game or an event and then run home to watch it. And the rest of us were left standing around, not having enough players to finish the game or whatever. So you realize how technology was having its impact on the haves, nots, by suddenly taking the haves away. And it also brings an interesting sort of story to mind. There was a couple living above our 1-bedroom apartment, and they were an older couple who had a farm. So on the weekends they would go to the farm, but they left a key for us to go and watch television on Friday and Saturday nights. And those were things to look forward to, because then we could watch wrestling and possibly, if we had been well behaved, a movie after that. So those are the kind of little simple treats that you had available to you, and otherwise you made your own fun. As an example, we would play basketball in the park by simply cutting out a peach basket, which were made out of kind of light wood, and cut out the bottom, tie it to a tree, take a soccer ball, pardon me, and then play basketball. So you never knew that was not the way basketball was played, but you at least could play sort of a poor person's basketball. And that was the way that we all sort of shared, and everybody was the same. Nobody had more than anybody else. Kids played well together, and the big treat was when we were going back to school, we would go shopping for a new pair of jeans, which were always a size or 2 longer, so that they could be rolled up and extended over time, a new pair of shoes, a new pair of runners. And I always look forward to getting a white pair of runners, because that was stylish, but then you realize that they got dirty very quickly, so it was kind of counterproductive. Then I went on to sort of high school again. We didn't have a car. Buses were available, but basically we walked anywhere and everywhere. And I remember one year taking at Christmas time, taking my brother and sister, and we walked 3.5 kilometers from our home downtown to the Eaton store to see their Christmas decorations. My brother and sister are a couple of 3 years younger than I am, so they were quite young, and we walked there and we walked back and didn't think anything of it. Other times, being the older sort of child in the neighborhood, parents would give me money to take their kids to the movie theater. So I'd have half a dozen kids that I would either walk with or take by bus, and the parents would give me, I think, about 45 cents, 15 cents for the movie ticket, 10 cents for the popcorn, and 10 cents each for the bus passage. So again, very simple lives, and you look forward to that. You enjoyed it, and you never thought much of it. At home, things were a little more challenging, in a sense that my father was a drinker, and in reality an alcoholic, and a smoker. The smoking part of it wasn't sort of an issue, but it was interesting because he would smoke about 2 to 3 packs a day, and I would help him roll at night, you know, and help him out as he put together his packages of cigarettes for work. Um, Interestingly enough, he worked for sort of maintenance work at the CN, and so they were quite generous in looking after their folks. The foreman would overlook people coming in with hangovers and so forth, and I found it interesting, and I was naive enough to wonder why they were selling on raffle tickets 28-ounce bottles of perfume, only later to find out it was really sort of whiskey that they were raffling off. So you can see how I didn't understand that particular culture, but my father was actually a very hard worker and never missed a day of work, although at times he'd be going to work hungover. So there was always a cloud in our home, never knowing whether we'd encounter a drunk father or a sort of a sober father, etc. And he never had a sense of something called play. He never saw that in his childhood, and he didn't feel that it was something that a person had to do. So he always had me be his forced laborer. And at times, my friends would come over and say, let's go and play. And he would not allow me to do that. It was just something that he could then prevent me from doing. And sometimes the work was just as simple as straightening out nails or watching him paint, whatever else. The point was he did not feel that play was a worthwhile sort of use of time. So in time, I really resented that in a sense that he took away something from me that I felt was a part of my childhood. But on the other hand, he was the sort of rule of law in the household. He believed in physical punishment. So the strap there, the belt was the sort of physical punishment. And yet he was generous when he was sober and kind, but I never felt close to him. And so that kind of sort of childhood made me realize that I did not want to sort of become a manual laborer. I wanted to escape that. Although I admired his talents, he could do electrical work, he could do plumbing, he could do welding, he could carpentry, whatever else. He took on everything, and he had a good mind for those kind of things and thought things out, and I admired that. But he was somewhat brutish in his way of dealing with me, and I think I kind of resented that. It was hard on my mother as well, because he would be verbally abusive, and especially when he was drunk, whatever else, and she could never sort of understand that, and just stayed in the household, enduring all of that. And then as she felt a sense of needing financial liberation, because of course he controlled the money, and so she started working evenings as a domestic cleaner, working at the university initially, then some businesses downtown. So she was away at night, and I think that sort of helped her sort of sanity. It came to a breaking point later on in my life, when one day my father not only verbally abused her, but started physically pushing her around. And by that time I was, in my latter teens. And so I grabbed him and I threw him out of the house. He was drunk at the time. And so I threw him out of the house and told him that I was basically going to call the police if he came back. So he, I don't know where he went. He found some accommodation, but he never forgave me for that. He always felt that I had crossed the line, and I never felt bad of what I did because he crossed the line that I could never forgive him for. I could forgive him the verbal abuse, but I could not look at the physical abuse that potentially would have accelerated over time. So, and there was a relief in a sense that now it was just the four of us instead of five of us. He would come around to get tools, whatever else, but there was no strong sort of relationship. It was more like he came around on the sly, etc. And I don't think we ever sort of reconciled that. We never really talked about it, but I knew that he would not forgive me for that, because again, a son would never do that to his father. I realized that school was really important, but I never sort of paid much attention to when I was going to junior high school. I would just do whatever work was required at school, but we never had homework per se. I never bothered really studying. And so I was just always an average student. And that continued on into high school until grade 12. And I realized that maybe there was a different way of handling school. So I realized that grade 12 was an important grade. At that time, we had departmentals, which meant that it was a pass or fail. There was no 20% classroom work, 30%, whatever. It was 100% was based on your departmental grade. So I decided I would develop a strategy to study for that. So I would, when I came home from school, I would basically go out to sleep after supper and then wake up when everybody else went to bed and studied all night. And that showed me that you could move ahead using that. So when I wrote my departmentals, I was just a percentage or two shy of an honors grade. And that allowed me to move on to the University of Manitoba, where I enrolled in an honors degree in biology. And then I, again, in my very last year, I found I wanted to, again, go on to graduate school. So I realized it was important to get a good grade. And again, I applied myself and got on the Dean's Honor Roll, which allowed me to get into the University of Alberta on a scholarship. And then I worked on a project up north, and that went really well. So I had initially been enrolled in a master's degree, but I had been so successful that my supervisor simply said, "Why don't you switch over to a PhD?" which I did. So it showed that if you really sort of applied yourself, that you could, you know, make the best of your potential. And I think it kind of sort of saddened me that, well, maybe it didn't either, because I never stressed myself about schoolwork and so forth until I finally had to. And then I realized when I had to sort of pay the price, there were significant sort of dividends associated with it. So, so life was really, in my childhood, as I reflect on it, life was simple and carefree because we were all in the same boat. And nobody knew any better. We had the basics that we needed in life. We were, there was sort of love there, more from my mother than from my father, but they both sort of looked after their children. And so poverty was never an issue per se. So I'm looking at some of my notes here to see, to make sure that I did not finish or did not leave anything out. Oh yes, and when I finished my degree, I took a job as a consultant for, that was 1974, as a consultant with biology consulting firm in Edmonton, and I was getting paid $18,000 a year. And when I came home from summer's work, there was an opportunity to work at Kamloops Lutheran College. It was a one-year position, but I jumped at it, and I was told that the best they could offer was $11,500, which I took without a second thought. So I took a one-third cut in salary, but again, it was something I wanted to do. And I guess this is the emphasis. You have to find in yourself what you're capable of handling. You have to find out what you want to do and what sacrifices you're prepared to make, and then follow your dream, in a matter of speaking, and recognize that life will have its ups and downs, challenges, whatever else. But in the long run, if you can come to my point in life and say it's been a wonderful sort of journey, I've met some wonderful people. I've had some wonderful experiences, and it's all been worthwhile. Then basically, you've got it made. Um, that's about all I want to sort of share in that area. And again, there'll be questions that you can sort of ask of me, and I'll try to answer them as best I can. But the two gifts I want to give you are a film. It's a National Film Board film that was produced in 1982 by a fellow that I grew up with, John Paskovich, and there's an interesting story there. John and I were childhood school friends. We lived a house apart, whatever else, and his stepfather had a pigeon coop, and so John and I would raise pigeons in that chicken coop. And one day, I came over to the pigeon coop, and found that his father had killed all the birds, and we had nothing. And I was so shocked and taken aback that I simply refused to talk to John ever again. And to this day, I have not talked to him or reached out to him. And he's been successful. He made the film. He's a photographer in Winnipeg, and has written a book. So I'll give you a book in a second. But the film that he made is simply called Ted Baerlich's Grocery. And if you just Google Ted Baerlich's, BaryLuk''S Grocery, the National Film Board film will come up. It's a 10-minute film, but it'll give you a sense of the neighborhood that I grew up in and the mentality of the people in that neighborhood. It's now a neighborhood that's been taken over by First Nations people because, again, the housing was cheap, etc. Unfortunately, the North End has become a somewhat crime-ridden area in that Point Douglas area, needless to say. So therefore, there are all kinds of issues in that area. But my memories of the area when I go back are ones of fondness. Then going back to the book, John Paskovich has published a book on the photographs of the North End, and the book is called A Place Not Our Own, A Place Not Our Own, the North End, Winnipeg. So if you look up that, it's just pictures of the North End, and as I go through the book, I can see places that just stand out as sort of childhood memories, etc. So it's interesting that the North End has bred a lot of people. That's where Burton Cummings was from. In fact, Burton Cummings was in my grade 10 class, and etc. And so it's a set of memories that I cherish, and every time I have a chance to go back to Winnipeg, I go back, but I realize that the landscape has changed so much, and yet you can't go back in time, but the memories will always last with you. So I think that's all I want to say, and I would be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have at this point in time. The life that you experience as a child does leave sort of impacts on you, and I realized that one of those was always being wary of people, not trusting, not believing things would happen, etc. So you come in with scar tissue from that kind of childhood. You ask yourself, why does a father who could quit smoking cold turkey, 3 packs a day, and yet not stop drinking, knowing that it impacted on his family and so forth? So you ask yourself, and then I chose never to drink hard liquor simply because what I saw it did to the family. It destroyed the family in many ways. I said to myself I would never treat women the way my father did, but it was a cultural thing too. You know, I mean, women were sort of possessions in a matter of speaking, and so I said to myself I would never be that way, and I've tried to be honest to that. So you stay with those. I buy excessively. I'll have 50 shirts. Whereas, if you look at the 20/80 sort of rule, you use those 20% of those shirts 80% of the time and vice versa. So you realize that those childhood scars do creep up and sort of sometimes sort of color your life a little bit more than you want them to.
Hmm.
Any questions?
Yes, Peggy Sue has said, thank you for sharing your story. This makes me want to talk with my dad even more. There were some striking similarities between your trajectories, I think. Thank you. And Helene has a question. She says, how did your childhood relationship with poverty influence how you taught your own kids about finances?
I think that my parents were always sort of generous, even with the limited amounts of money they had. My grandfather paid for my university education, undergraduate. It was only $400 a year. So he looked after that. And that was because my parents sort of coerced him into doing that. He was living at in our place anyways. So the idea of parents helping children was there. And I think when I had my own sons, I kind of spoiled them. Because I wasn't spoiled. So I did things for them that I never had done for myself. And I think that it was counterproductive. My father forced me to do things. I never forced my sons to do things. So I would cut the grass instead of them cutting the grass, etc. And so therefore it was an unfortunate tragedy because they never learned how to handle a hammer. I did. They never had to straighten nails. I did. And so you realize that you deprive them of things. I never used physical punishment. That was one thing. I would use verbal, punishment, whatever else, but never. So I think that I tried to shelter them, but in sheltering them, I think I did not do the right thing. I should have been more a father than a friend. And so I think there's a price that that they're going to be paying for it because they have a good sense of financial responsibility, but they got that from their mother.
So thank you very much for sharing your story. And some of it I can relate to because I grew up with 4 siblings and we lived in mobile homes. And because of my dad's work, we actually moved like every 6 months, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever, right? So life in a mobile home with 5 kids and 2 parents, so it was fun. Anyways, my question is, so when your house burnt down, who was responsible for that? Was it kids playing with matches?
Well, we had a coal burning stove, and it was a 2-story house, and I remember many times sitting upstairs in a bedroom and seeing the pipe that went across the room because the exposed pipe was the heating source, and it was red hot. So I don't know if it was something that caught on fire or faulty, whatever it is. I was never privy to that. I guess I was too young to inquire about it or need to know. And all I know is that there was some insurance money that came out of it, and I think that's what allowed us to come to Winnipeg and to buy that 4-plex, whatever else. So I never knew sort of the story behind it, but it burnt down to the sort of basement. And I remember playing in the sort of burnt out basement, and the granary was a rectangular building. And so it wasn't insulated. So we only stayed there for basically the latter spring, summer, and into the fall. And then we didn't overwinter because there was no insulation. But it was an adventure, it was and I think you probably remember from your own childhood, you go along with the flow. You don't think about those kind of things. You just, you're a part of it, but you're not totally involved in it. So I can't really answer what was behind it. But a tragedy turned out.
Sorry, you just take what life gives you,
Yeah,
and you
exactly.
enjoy what you can with it, right? With the coal stove, I would say it was probably the creosote in the stovepipe that caught fire. If it got so red hot, that would be the cause of it.
Could be.
My other question was, what was your degrees that you took when you went to university?
Well, I got my honors degree in biology at the University of Manitoba. It was a 4-year degree. An honors degree was 4 years, and then just a general degree was 3 years. So I took that, and then I applied for a master's program at the University of Alberta, and it was a biological studies program in the high Arctic. So it was a major international project, and it was supposed to be only a 2-year project, but because things were going so well, my supervisor basically wanted me to stay on to finish it. Otherwise, he would have had to bring somebody else in. So that gave me an opportunity to spend another 2 years and skip my master's and then simply get my PhD. So that was a good experience too, because, and then I remember again, you know, I had to study for my orals. So I spent 1 full month every day just reviewing literature and so forth. And that's, so again, you know, when you focus on something and you apply yourself, you may surprise yourself as to how much you can accomplish. But it's hard work, you have to, and there's no way about it. And I guess I found that out at the end of each sort of major point in my educational thing, that if you wanted the grades, you had to work hard and study.
Thank you very much for sharing.
Well, thank you for sharing as well, and reflecting on your own childhood. Any other questions?
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Quickly, when did you notice, or when did Point Douglas, that neighborhood, change? I know there used to be a very inappropriate joke in Winnipeg, but it was about Selkirk Avenue sort of separating the Indigenous and Ukrainian communities. So I'm just wondering, when did that happen? That the Ukrainian community definitely seems to have moved up Main and further into the North End.
I think as soon as people became established, had jobs that gave them a steady income, whatever else, as soon as they could buy more and better, they moved out. I mean, that was the reality of it. It's really sad that when I looked at our own street, there was a mixture of Indigenous families and Ukrainians, and the Indigenous people were primarily living in rentals. So therefore, they weren't as well looked after by the landlords or whatever else, etc. And the families that had their own homes looked after them much better. So there was already a differentiation whether you owned a home or whether you rented a home. And as the people sort of left, in many cases, somebody would, well, there was a time, I think, no, the Filipinos moved more into areas other than the Point Douglas area, because I really lived on the Selkirk, Pritchard, Lorne area. And I think eventually they were more sort of settled by the Indigenous people who could find cheaper rentals, whatever else. The park was there, so it was good for the kids, etc. And but you know, it was kind of sad to see how the Indigenous people were treated. It was they were taken advantage of, and so forth. And yeah, it was just even at that young age, I could see that there were people who were treated worse than we were. We were displaced people, DPs, which was fine, but at least you know, we had some advantage in home ownership, whatever else, except so yeah. And I think there was a kind of a separation. We didn't have too many Indigenous students in our school, etc. So, but there wasn't really racism per se that I experienced.
Okay, I'm just going to out myself and let you know that I did live on Austin Street in Point Douglas.
Austin,
But
okay.
in the 80s and 90s, so we were actually the only white family living in Point Douglas, and so we were directly behind the Sutherland Hotel, and certainly what I observed was pretty wild, but as you say.
Yeah, Main Street at that point was, you know, the stores were closing down, the bakery closed down, etc. And yeah, it was turning, I'll use the word turning ugly in the sense that you would walk down the street and you were always watching who was around you, whatever else, etc. So if you watch Ted Berlick's store, there were one, two, three, I think 3 stores when I first came to Lorne Avenue, and then his remained. And maybe when you look at Ted's sort of short clip, you'll have a sense of the neighborhood, because he talks about the indigenous people coming in now and so forth, and the flavor of the community changing. So how did you enjoy your was that your childhood there?
Yeah, that was my, basically my teens, 80s and 90s. And then when I started university, I lived still on Austin Street, and then eventually moved to Langside and Furby. It was
Okay,
close.
there you are. Yeah, people move to the other side of the tracks, in a matter of speaking. But and if you go back there, things have really changed. You know, I mean, Norquay School that I went to is still there, of course, and they've refurbished it. I went to what's the junior high school just down? I forget the name of the high school now, but you know, and things have changed in that area too. Selkirk has really changed dramatically as well.
Oh, I do love that area because it is so full of history, and I like watching, you know, the buildings and what's changed. And it is, people are trying to create more sense of community. Like it's, although, yeah, it's different, but in so many ways so rich. And I go on dates with the city. I go back to Winnipeg every year, and
Good
just
for you. Good for you. That's wonderful. Yeah, because you'll pick up memories and bring back memories that you know, some special occasion or whatever else. Good for you. Enjoy it.
Sharon puts in the chat, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. It correlates a lot with other immigrant experiences, so I guess that's comforting and question mark.
Yeah, and I admire the people, you know, because my father worked hard, my mother worked hard, and that was what got us got through and out of the situation. I mean, let's face it, you know, hard work pays off. And when I've experienced the sort of refugees that have come to Canada in the 80s from Vietnam, etc., you realize that what they cashed in on was hard work. They were willing to do the work that nobody else wanted to do. And yet we were so afraid that they were going to take jobs away from us. No, they never took jobs away from us. They simply took the jobs that the rest of the people didn't want. And I remember my mother, you know, going, cleaning floors, whatever else, and so forth, and never being ashamed of her or her being ashamed of the work she was doing. So I think that it's amazing what people who come here with nothing can accomplish if they simply take advantage of the opportunities that are given to them. And that's the name of the game. Marianne? Nope, is she there? 2 nice little boys, wonderful, enjoy them.
Oh. Thank you so much for sharing today.
Not at all. You just enjoy those little guys there. They look like they're well fed, they're well dressed, and they're loved. They'll be all right.
It's quite an old picture now, but it's such a cute one. I keep it.
Good stuff. And thank you, Nancy, for the opportunity. It's just wonderful what you've developed. And you were saying next year is your 25th anniversary?
It is the 25th anniversary of the Human Library coming up next academic year.
Well, thank you for that opportunity once again. And for all of you for checking in as well. I appreciate that.
Well, thank you for sharing your story, Michael. I mean, I've heard your story before, but I'm always kind of amazed, I guess, at resilience. And I know you say as a child you don't see the poverty and stuff, and I think I understand what that. But I think you've also, consciously or not, taken the positive out of all of that into your adult life. And I think as a result then, I mean, in my observation, you've been a great teacher, a great father, great community person. And
those are the kind
you've got
things,
wonderful kids.
well, those are the kind of things that, you know, you hope you know can be said about you. And I appreciate that very much, Nancy, because I was surrounded by good people as well. And you know, that's the name of the game. In life, you'll find hardships, but you'll find a lot of other nice people out there. And if you reach out to them, you can have wonderful relationships.
Yeah.
One story I didn't tell you about, when we were living out in East Selkirk, as I said, we didn't have much food. And so there was a section gang nearby where we would go, my mother would go and get pails of slop for the pigs. Well, one day she comes back and she's pouring the slop out, and there's a steak in the slop pail. So guess who had steak that night? So you realize, you know, somebody would say, oh, you know, germy, on and on and on. It was meat. She cleaned it off, she cooked it, and we had steak. So I reflect on it not in saying, how could she do that? How gross, whatever else. You know, how wonderful that this woman realized that it was food that could be used. And so you realize, you know, again, one of the things that I really, another story was I went with my father to auction sales. And I was in primary school. And at school, I told my teacher what a wonderful experience it was. And when we had parent-teacher interviews, she told my father how excited I was about going with him. And when he came home, he said, don't you ever, ever talk about that again to anybody, because only poor people go to auction sales and secondhand stores. And I suddenly realized that we were poor, I guess, because we did those kind of things. But I delight in auction sales and going to secondhand stores and bookstores and so forth. So, you know, those kind of things and styles don't bother me, you know, but having clean clothing and so forth is important. So you realize that you carry a lot of things from your childhood with you.
Sure. And, you know, it's not too late to teach your kids how to use a hammer. I mean, we're building a fence here in the next weeks if they want a hands-on practical.
I think there'll be some interest, but that's thank you for the offer.
And to everybody, I did put the link to the video in the calendar, and I will do the book too. I just didn't get the title, so when we're all done here, I'll get that from Michael.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Is there anything from anybody else before we end today's session? Nope, just thanks again. Thank you for sharing your story.
Thank you for the opportunity. That's been it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thanks, everyone.